Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Before we begin, we want to thank Nate and Iris and David for creating such a beautiful breakfast for us this morning.
I had nothing to do with it.
Well, you were in the kitchen. You were in the kitchen.
I was kibitzing.
Kibitzing. Well, that counts a lot. It was really lovely, and so thank you so much for getting up and doing all of that. It really was very, very nice. It's nice to just be able to sit around and talk to each other and kibitz and all of that. So it's delicious. Thank you. We're ready to commence our service. We're going to begin with Shabbat morning service 2. Don't ask me what the difference is between 1 and 2, but we're going to give it a try and see what that feels like. Page 287 in the middle of the page. Let us join in prayer responsively. We give thanks to you, O God, for this Shabbat day, which unites us as a community of faith and hope.
For the holiness of Shabbat, which can lead us to fulfill the best that is in us. We give thanks.
For memories of Shabbat enriched by generations of our people who observed it, and from it drew courage to face hardships and light to banish darkness, we are grateful.
We offer thanks for the peace of Shabbat, the great consecrated family love.
O God, our turning to you exalt our humanity. You are the joy of our life, the source of its greatness, its power, and its beauty.
Help us, God, to find inspiration for the coming week. Help us to find peace within ourselves and one another.
And let us turn to page 293 to page 295, the Birkat al Nisim B'chol Yom, miracles for each day, and we can just read that silently, or just recite these blessings silently. Please now turn to page 312, the Chatzi Kaddish, followed by the Baruch Hu. Please rise.
V'yitgadol Shmei Rabbi Yom Hadibrachu Teviam Nichmachotei V'chayei Chol V'yom Echon Uv'chayei Dechol Beit Yisrael Bagala Uv'izman Kariv V'miru Amein Yehi Shmei Rabba Mivarach Ve'alam Ulam Me'alayla Yitbarach V'ishtabach V'yitpa'ar V'yitromam V'yitrasei V'yitadai V'yitalei
You may be seated. Let us join together in a prayer, the prelude to the Shema, page 317, O God, inspiration and guide for all. Page 317, the prelude to the Shema, will rise on page 318. O God, inspiration and guide for all, you have spoken in 1,000 tongues for us to hear. In every land and every age, your children have heard you and imagined you in separate ways. And yet, O God, you are one, unifier of humanity. We give thanks for the sages and teachers who bring us understanding of your will. Gratefully, we recall the lawgivers and prophets, the psalmists and sages of Israel. And joyfully, we remember that from the dawn of Israel's life, we would turn to you and find purpose. May the teachings of our ancestors live on in our minds, and their passion for righteousness stir our hearts. Help us to live so that our daily conduct reveals the beauty and wisdom of your truth. Baruch atah Adonai, habocher bi'amon Yisrael bi'ahava. Please rise for the Shema, page 318.
Shema Yisrael,
Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. You may be seated. We continue with the V'ahavta. Advarim ha'eleh
Asher Elohim
Yitzcharecha
Hayom
al navecha
Vishinantam levanecha Vidibartam Bishivtecha Bevetecha
Uvlechtecha b'derech Uv'shochbecha Uv'kumecha
Ushaktam
Leot hayadecha V'hayu litotafot beinenecha Uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha Uvisharecha
Leman tiskeru
V'asitem et kol mitzvotai V'yitem kedoshim le'Elohechem Ani Adonai Elohechem Asher hotzeiti etem me'eretz Mitzrayim Liot lachem le'Elohim Ani Adonai Elohechem. And we continue now on page 322, the Mi Chamocha at the top of the page.
We'll do a little slower version, so please join in with me. Mi Chamocha
Elohim Adonai, Mi Kamocha Nedar Bakol Sur Yisrael, Kuma Biazrat Yisrael, Ufdeichenu Mecha Yehuda v'Yisrael, Go'aleinu Adonai Tzivaot Shemo Kadosh Yisrael, Baruch Atah Adonai, Ga'al Yisrael. Please rise for the Tefillah, page 323, continuing on through the Kedusha to page 327. We begin on page 323.
Adonai sevatai tiftach udvia ita hilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu, v'Elokei Avotenu v'Imotenu, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, v'Elokei Yaakov, Elokei Sarah, Elokei Rivka, Elokei Rachel, v'Elokei Leah. Ha'el ha'gadol ha'gibor v'na'orah, Elyon, gomer chasadim tovim, v'konei hakol, v'zocher hasiyavot v'imahot, u'mevii geulah livnei bneihem, למען שמו באהבה, מלך עוזר ומשיח ומגן. ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם ויצחק שרה.
Page 325.
אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי הכל אתה, רב להושיע. מחכה חיים בחסד, מחיי הכופר רק עמים רבים, צומח נופלים ברוחי חולים, ומתיר אסורים. ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומי דומה לך, מלך ממיט ומחיה ומצליח ישועה. ונאמן אתה להחיות החול, ברוך אתה אדוני לחיי הכל.
Page 326.
נקדש את שמך בעולם, כשם שמקדישים אותו בשמי מרום, ככתוב היד נביאך, וכרוז זה אמר. קדוש, 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 אדוני צבאות, מלוך הארץ, כבודו. אדיר, אדירנו אדוני, אדוננו מדהים שמך בכל הארץ. ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו. אחד הוא אלוהינו, הוא אבינו ומלכנו, ומושיענו והוא
going to continue silently in silent meditation, either just in your own thoughts or prayers, or in the prayer book, continuing from page 328 to 337. You may be seated if that is your tradition. If you wish to stand, of course you may. We're going to continue now with the Oseh Shalom on page 337.
Oseh Shalom,
Om Bimromav, Uyaseh Shalom Aleinu, V'al Kol Yisrael Ve'imeru Amen. Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Uyaseh Shalom Aleinu, V'al Kol Yisrael Ve'imeru Amen. Our service now continues with the Seder Hotzat HaTorah, the Seder Kriyat HaTorah, our service for the reading of the Torah. And that will begin with opening the Ark, beginning with Ki Mitzion, which may be found on page 362. David, could I call on you to open the Ark and to hold the Torah? I'm sorry, page 364, please rise.
Mitzion tetzei Torah, Ki Mitzion tetzei Torah, Udvar Adonai beYerushalayim.
We continue with Baruch Shanatan on page 366.
Baruch Shenatan Torah, Torah. Baruch Shenatan Torah, Torah. Le'amo Yisrael B'Kedushato.
We continue with the Shema, page 366. Our cantor will chant each line and then we'll repeat.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo.
Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo.
Gadol Adonai iti, u'rama Shemo yavdav. Adonai hagidura ve'hagibura ve'hatifer ve'hanetzach ve'hahod. Iho b'shamayim ve'ha'aretz, Iho b'shamayim ve'ha'aretz. Echad Adonai Amacha, ve'hamid na'aseh lechol erosh.
You may be seated. Well, this is probably, as some of you heard in my sermon last night, a very, very rich parsha, a very rich portion, because it has both the Decalogue, the repetition of the Ten Commandments, the Aseret HaDibrot, and also the Shema and the V'ahavta, two obviously very well known and I would venture to say universal passages that many people, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, are quite familiar with, at least one of the two. But I suspect that the Shema and the V'ahavta are also well known in non-Jewish circles as well. Our reading will, we're going to read both sections. We're going to divide the aliyot into two groups. I know it's not going to be the left and the right side. Those of you who are in the adult Hebrew, whether class 1 and 2, you will get the Shema and the V'ahavta, and I hope that based on your continuing learning of Hebrew, you'll be able to recognize. I'll read them very slowly, so you'll be able to follow in the Torah. In fact, I would ask for those of you who are familiar with it to actually read it. I didn't tell anybody in advance, so I don't want to put anybody on the spot. Especially because, of course, in the Torah text, unlike the Siddur, there's no vowels and there's no punctuation. So it can be a little bit disorienting. Also, the words tend to be closer together. They're not as well spaced out. So everybody so we're going to begin with the Decalogue, or what's known as the Ten Commandments. There's a prelude, which actually begins on chapter 5, verse 1. So all of you that are not in Adult Hebrew 1 or 2, I'll ask you all to come up.
Do you want me to go?
Yes, that would be fine, sure. A gabbai for those of you who may not be familiar with what a gabbai does. A gabbai reads a vowel text, follows along in the vowel text, so that if the reader makes a mistake, the reader is to read the Torah perfectly, so therefore has to stop and continue. Good, okay, got a nice group here.
So where are we here?
We're at the spring
I know that, but
right there.
I want to give them the right.
Page 1354, and that is in verse 1. if you see, it's in the second column or the column closest to the binding, the third line.
Third line, it looks like a little olive
Yeah,
or a little N.
I'll wait for, I guess Ann is going to have to get a plot. Okay. 1355.
Four.
Excuse me,
1354.
1354, where that little olive is in the
Second
column
column.
that's closest to the binding on the inner part, that column, beginning the third line from the top where that little olive appears. Okay. Join in the and when we get to the actual recitation of the Ten Commandments, everybody must rise for that. Okay.
We're starting, when are we starting here?
We're starting.
Yeah, I think we're starting in 6.
Starting here.
You are starting. Okay.
Ready? Baruch hu et Adonai hamvarach.
Baruch Adonai hamvarach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai hamvarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bachar banu mikol hamim. Natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Vayikra Moshe El Kol Yisrael Vayomer Alehem Shema Yisrael Et HaChukim V'et HaMishpatim Asher Anochi Yechi Dover Be'oznechem Hayom Ulemartem Otam Ushmartem Liasotam Adonai Eloheinu Karat Imanu Brit Bechorev Lo Et Avotenu Karat Adonai Et Habrit Hazot Ki Itanu Anachnu Elefo Hayom Kulanu Chayim Panim Befanim Diber Adonai Imachem Bahar Mitoch HaEsh Anochi Omed Ben Adonai Uvenechem Ba'et Hahi V'hagid Lachem Et Devar Adonai Ki Yireitem Mipnei HaEsh V'lo Alitem Bahar Le'mor.
Please rise. Please rise.
Anochi Adonai Elohecha Asher Hotzeiticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim Mibeit Avonim Lo Yeh Lecha Elohim Acherim Al Panai Lo Ta'aseh L'chafeseh Kol Temuna Asher Bashamayim Imal V'asher Ba'aretz Mitachat V'asher B'mayim Mitachat La'aretz Lo Tishtachaveh Lachem V'lo Te'avdein Ki Anochi Adonai Elohecha Elkana Pokein Avon Avot Al Banim V'al Shleishim V'al Rebeim L'son Ai V'yosech Esed Li'alafim Li'ohavai Ulshomrei Mitzvotai Lo Tisa Et Shem Adonai Elohecha Lashav Ki Lo Yinakeh Adonai Et Asher Yisa Et Shemo Lashav Shamor Et Yom HaShabbat Lekadsho Kasher Tzivcha Adonai Elohecha Sheshet Yamim Ta'avod V'asita Kol Melachtecha V'yom HaShvi'i Shabbat L'Adonai Elohecha Lo Ta'aseh Kol Melacha אתה ובנך וביתך, ועבדך ועמתך, ושורך וחמורך וכל בחמתך, וגרך אשר בשעריך, למען ינוח עבדך ועמתך כמוך, וזכרת כי עבד היית בארץ מצרים, ויוציאך אדוני אלוהיך משם ביד חזקה ובזרוע נטויה, על כן ציווך אדוני אלוהיך לעשות את יום השבת, כבד את אביך ואת אמך, כאשר ציווך אדוני אלוהיך, למען יאריכון ימיך ולמען ייטב לך על האדמה אשר אדוני אלוהיך נותן לך. לא תרצה ולא תנאה ולא תגנב ולא תענב רעך, עד שוב לא תחבוד אשת רעך, לא תתאווה בית רעך שדהו ועבדו ועמותו שורו וחמורו וכל אשר לרעך. Maybe seated.
No. We don't say this yet?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
You can sit down.
Just gonna say. Ready? Baruch et Adonai habarach. Baruch Adonai habarach.
No.
Baruch Adonai.
No, we're off. That's okay. A lot of people make this
okay.
mistake. I've been known to do too. On the second blessing, we leave off the Baruch Hu. It's just Baruch atah Adonai.
Oh, okay.
Ready? 1,
2, 3.
3.
Baruch.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu et Torah.
Amen. V'chaye Elon atah b'tochenu, Baruch atah Adonai, noten haTorah.
יישר כוח. Very good.
I am programmed, don't change things.
You see on TV?
Yeah, you're great. You can see this part. No, you're gonna jump to it.
It's in verse 6. Where is it? Should be verses right there. And now we're going to go to chapter 6, beginning with verse 4, and that is on page 1366,
1366.
beginning with verse 4. We'll call it the second group now.
Who's ever been my student?
All of the students in the adult Hebrew class.
Either one.
And I'm not going to chant it, I'm just going to read it, and I'd like those of you that feel comfortable to come close to the Torah and
What's the
to
chanting
try to
one?
read it.
Is chanting it is close to what we chant, right? It's the same
Yeah,
trope.
yeah, it's exactly the
It's the
same
exact
trope.
same trope.
Would the group prefer to chant, or would the group prefer to read?
I think we should chant.
Are you talking about the blessings or the Torah?
I'm not talking
The
about
actual,
the Torah.
the actual,
We're gonna
because
read
it's the
Shema and
same,
Haftarah.
it's the same via Haftarah.
Oh.
It's no different,
Yeah.
but we could look at it here.
Right, then the only question is, would you prefer to read, or would you prefer it to be chanted?
Can you chant with us?
Yeah, I like chanting.
Let's
It's
chat
fine
with
for
us.
me.
We'll just chat with us, so you can kind of lead us, no?
Yeah.
You want us to come closer so we can look? Come
Yeah,
closer so we can see.
Yeah.
Plus-
Actually, you can come close like that, so you can see it directly.
And
So the first thing we do is we take our siddur, and we take kiss right there, because that's the part that we're going to read.
see where it says
Yeah.
Shema?
So you take our siddur and you go like this.
Yep.
Right at the first word, right? And then we do the blessing.
Yeah, you start right there. Baruch Hu.
Baruch hu et Adonai hamborach.
Baruch
Adonai hamborach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bakar banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Come close.
Yeah, come
Come
close.
close so you can see it in here.
I'll look over this shoulder.
Come
Okay,
close.
yeah,
Come
come very
close.
close. Would somebody like to hold the
Yeah,
pointer?
come hold the
and
yod and you can see it.
Yeah.
comes here. Seriously, because you can see it.
Okay, so now we're going to
Shema.
try to read it together.
There's Israel, Adonai, just it's stretched out.
Okay.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'kol levavecha u'b'kol nafshecha u'b'kol me'odecha v'hayu hadvarim ha'eleh asher anoki mitzaveka hayom alavavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam v'shivteka b'veitecha uv'lechteka v'derek uv'shakbeka uv'kumecha uktavtam leot al yadeka v'hayu letotafot beineineka uktavtam al mezuzot beitecha uvisharecha.
I'll hold it. Somebody wants to take a photograph.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam natan et betokenu Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
And beautifully
See, it's not
done.
so hard.
And it's amazing.
Follow.
Mostly, but I
It's
already.
the stretched out words that I want.
Yeah, I'd like to know why they're so stretched out.
To fill the line,
fill-
right?
Well,
I
the
think
Shema stands out, and there's all
The,
kinds
yeah,
of
the
traditions.
Shema really does
Yeah.
stand
And the
out.
Echad is just like it's special too, right? Because
Yeah, the
of all
Dalit
it.
and the Shem.
Yeah,
They
there's
stand
some
out for
James, we need the cheat sheet, don't we?
You did great.
For people like that, they just let it read.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Please,
On the first section where you read,
yeah.
towards one of the ends, some of the letters were way expanded.
That's what we were just talking about.
And then farther on down, there were like 3 columns, which is not like the
Right.
rest of it.
Right.
Yeah, we'll
That's
talk
the
about
Ten
that.
Commandments,
I
yeah.
was hoping maybe we'd have a little bit of time, not a lot of time, but a little time to have a discussion afterwards, as soon as we put the Torah back. So let's save it and
You got
we'll
to see
answer,
it, yeah.
well, I'll try to answer some of these questions. Some of them are just like Tevye's answer, it's tradition.
Okay, we're done with this.
That's a good answer. Tradition.
Yeah, well, there's a whole scribal history in terms of how to write the Torah. And that scribal history is passed on to each of the people who make a living writing Sifrei Torahs. You know, it takes about a year to actually write. From the time you commission someone to do that, to commission the writing of a scroll, it takes about a year to do an entire scroll.
It's amazing to watch that process.
Rick, can I invite you to open the ark as we put the Torah back? Yeah. Please rise. We're going to continue with Yehalalu and then the Eitz Chaim, and that can be found. Thank you.
Of course.
That can be found on page 374. may be seated. So we have some questions. I was hoping we'd have time for a little discussion. Last time we did so, and that was, you know, I certainly learned. So you had an observation about, as you looked at the Torah.
And part of the segment the rabbi was reading, some of the letters were way expanded towards the end. And then there was another section that was totally different, was columns. It was what, three or four columns?
Yeah, I think you're referring to near the end of the Ten Commandments.
Right.
There's the thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, all of that's that section. I'll try to answer the second question first. There are sort of lining rules, and also there's scribal traditions where certain letters are like extended. So for example, in the Shema, the ayin is much bigger, and the daled at the end of echad, the Hebrew letter echad, is also usually more bold than the other letters of the Shema. The reason for that, at least there is that if you put those two letters together in Hebrew, it spells ed, and that means witness. So when you're reciting the Shema, you are bearing witness to the oneness, the uniqueness, the one God of the world. So those letters are bold to be that way. That's kind of intentional. Some of it has to do with the actual lining, that certain words, certain lines have got to fit within the column structure. Now, what you're referring to, because the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments, Aseret HaDibrot, are so important, like for example, they represent the giving of the Torah. So when we stand for that, what we are doing, we are symbolically placing ourselves back at Sinai again. Because the Ten Commandments, Aseret HaDibrot, is representative of the whole Torah. The other thing that the rabbi said, I've never been able to do, that all the 613 commandments have their basis in those 10. So that's why we stand for the Aseret HaDibrot, and because once again, we are bearing witness to that unique relationship that we have. So that's now there's one other tradition that you may have picked up on. I don't know if anybody was sensitive enough, but I kind of ran out of breath by the time I got to number 10. You are supposed to recite from the one, the first of the thou shalt not, and the lo tignov, thou shalt not steal. If you can hear the word of the tignov, if you know any Yiddish, ganef. Okay, he's a ganef, he's a thief. The root of ganef is the tignov. You can almost hear it. It's gimel nun vet, lignov, which is to steal in modern Hebrew as well as biblical Hebrew. Lignov. So tignov is biblical Hebrew for you shall not, and that can be read as an imperative, which is how we normally translate it. But it's also an imperfect tense. By that I mean it's a verb that hasn't been completed. In other words, thou will not steal. Now, the reason the reader reads it in one breath is that these things are so obvious that you should not concentrate on them. You shouldn't even contemplate them because they're so egregious. It's way outside the bounds of what civilization must rest on. And if you think about those three or four, thou shalt not steal. If you think of thou shalt not be unfaithful to one's partner, to one's spouse. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. You can't go into court and lie. As a lawyer, I found our society and had some difficulties with that. So as a barrier to prevent that, we have cross-examination to try to get to the truth. I'm being kind, kind of tongue in cheek about that. There's another one.
Thou shalt kill.
What's that? Yeah, right. Thou shalt not kill. if you start thinking about, oh, gee, we're not doing so well, maybe we should take some breaths in between and focus on, because our society, I mean, there's all kinds of real, and those crimes that are committed carry with it the death penalty. That all of the 10 actually carry with it biblically, even the keeping of the Sabbath carries with it if violated. Now, there's all kinds of safeguards against ever executing someone for some of these. Give you an example that underpins the death penalty in Judaism is you have to have two things. You have to have, number one, you have to have two witnesses. For any death penalty case, you must have at least two witnesses. And not only that, they have to be eyewitnesses. They can't be, you can't convict on circumstantial evidence. And there's a very classic case that's very interesting. If witnesses see somebody chasing another with a sword and they go into a ruin, and the person with the sword comes out with blood on the sword, the Talmud says it's as if he hasn't witnessed anything. So the person, you can't draw that inference that we could, because the penalty is so great that you can't draw that inference. Not only that, the two witnesses have to give warning beforehand to not kill the person chasing. So not only do they have to, yeah, I mean, so they took the death penalty, the rabbis, in creating this, took the death penalty very, very seriously. They couldn't wipe out the death penalty that was written in the Torah, because from their perspective, the Torah was given by God to Moses, and you can't change, you can't take an eraser and erase those passages if you really hold to that, if you really believe that this is the word of God at some level. And I think all of us at some level do, and would be very hesitant to take an eraser and just erase portions that in our time we don't find to be, with contemporary sensibility. So what we've done is we have created, there's a very funny story that's in the Talmud where God disagrees, or the heavenly voice disagrees with the majority view on a particular matter of Jewish law. And the heavenly voice comes out and says, you're wrong, the majority are wrong. This one person's view of how to read the Torah correctly is the correct view. And a rabbi from the majority stands up and says, I'll translate it, Lo bashamayim hi, cites to God, which means the Torah is not in heaven. The Torah is here on earth.
They say that to God?
What's
Yeah, they say that to God.
Yeah, it's a midrashic story. It's a very interesting story. It's called the stove of Achnai. Had to do with koshering, whether a stove, which was made in a different way, was kosher or not. That was the big debate. And the rabbi said it wasn't kosher, and one rabbi said it was, and one rabbi performs all kinds of miracles to support his views, and they discount the miracles, saying we don't follow miracles when it comes to Jewish law. We don't pay attention to that. Finally, the heavenly voice comes down and says blah blah blah, and one rabbi stands up and says, Lo bashamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven, citing that's a passage from the Torah. So the rabbis took the Torah and used it against God, saying that the right to interpret the Torah rests with us. You gave it to us, but it's our right to interpret it. I got way off the topic, I apologize, but that's my tendency to want to overteach. Go ahead.
Something that you said earlier about the two witnesses have to give warning, the old saying, what if there is no way for the witnesses to give warning? Let's say the two witnesses are, let's say
walking down the
on a
street,
hilltop, and they can't shout down because they're not within shouting distance. Doesn't work. Okay, so
Now,
that was that. But
now this is not to say that there could be some modifications, like DNA evidence today. Like they didn't have DNA back in the times of the Torah. How would that determine? Now, there's a big debate afterwards I didn't share with you. So Rabbi Akiva said, they were discussing this business about witnesses, just like you said. and Rabbi Kiva says that a Sanhedrin, a rabbinic court, had to have 71 judges, by the way, in death penalty cases. That you would, but of course you just have to have a simple majority, 36. Okay, so Rabbi Kiva said that if a Sanhedrin, a rabbinic court, would execute, would make a pronouncement of the death penalty, once in 70 years, it would be a court that would have blood on its hands. So another rabbi said, well, if that's the case, you would let murderers run rampant, run rampant in Israel. So there is this tension, but in Israel, there's no death penalty. There's only one person who ever got the death penalty in Israel. Eichmann, right. That was the only case in the history of the state of Israel. Now, I'm not saying that, imprisonment is right. I mean, that's a whole different question. But the sacredness of human life, regardless, is in Jewish law is highly sacred.
Well, one question I have.
Oh, by the way, one other thing, you should know this, that also a safeguard against perjury in those kinds of cases, in every case, that if witnesses testify and it turned out that they were impeached, that you couldn't have witnesses because we have 3 witnesses that said you were at the bar down the street and they saw you and they came and testified. They couldn't have witnessed the bank robbery down the street, okay? Because he was with us the whole time. And say the court found the testimony incredible. The witnesses would suffer the penalty that would have been incurred had their testimony stood. So that was another safeguard against perjury. That if you testify falsely, you're going to get the penalty that would have happened had you not committed perjury. So that was another personal safeguard. And it was pretty strict stuff there about. And what's behind all of that? Okay, because I've done some, I wrote my rabbinic thesis sort of on this topic, was it's not that they were trying to penalize the person who committed perjury. That wasn't their concern. I can say that after lots and lots of research. They were concerned about the person taking an oath and taking God's name in vain. That was the rationale. Or they did not want somebody to take a false oath. The oath back in those days meant something. Swearing in the name of God was a very, very serious thing in the eyes of the court, in the eyes of the Bet Din, in the eyes of Jewish law, right? Because if you go into the Decalogue, you see, thou shalt not take God's name in vain. Right? That's a specific commandment. You should not testify falsely. That's, I don't know if that's helpful, but if you think about, I don't know if you remember some of these challenges about the 10 Commandments being on public property, right? And the whole big debate was, should it stay there, should it not there? My response when I was in rabbinical school and all this kind of stuff was going on, I think we should all be more concerned about just trying to follow them as opposed to worrying about where we're going to put them, as a symbol, because, when you really think about it, those 10 Commandments are still pretty relevant. Many of them are still, pretty doggone relevant today, and we seem to have a difficult time as a society, as a world, just following 10, let alone 613, right?
The one question I did have on the reading was the commandment, thou shalt not murder.
Mm-hmm.
And I read the commentary below.
I was hoping you wouldn't, but go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
It says, the older translation was, you shall not kill. I thought it was the other way around. So it says, due to the English, we had to prescribe to kill versus murder because killing could be accidental or in wartime, where murder is malicious and with the intent. So
let me take a look at your text.
Right there.
Thank you. I need my glasses. What do I do with them?
Needs his glasses. One of us could read it if glasses.
I need the Hebrew. Hold on a second. Lo tirtzach. Lo tirtzach is murder. Lo tignov, thou shalt not steal. Yeah, you shall not kill, okay, yeah, right, yeah. And, in the Hebrew, you're right. The Hebrew ritzach is more killing, which can be maybe less voluntary, but the rodef is really to pursue someone, and a rodef is one who pursues someone to kill, like first degree murder. So the Hebrew is different. The titzach, it was a different. Tignov is always stealing. That comment relates to another, to lo titzach, thou shalt not kill. And killing is a little bit different than murder legally. It results in the same thing, but it's slightly different. Now, since we're on the subject of contemporary law, right, I'm going to switch this back. In Jewish law, relative to abortion, because abortion is a very hot topic now, the Jewish position, on the traditional Jewish position, is that prior to the time that the head emerges, if the mother is in hard travail, then the life of the mother takes precedent over the life of the fetus. The fetus does not incur the status of a human being in Jewish law until the head emerges, until it begins to breathe on its own. That's, I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong, there can be all kinds of debates on that. Now, what's tempered a little bit is that there's a mitzvah of peru urvu, of being fruitful and multiplying. And if you're capable of having children and bearing children, then you should have children, because that fulfills one of the commandments of the Torah, which is to be fruitful and to multiply and fill the earth. So, you know, it tips in favor, of course, of giving birth. Now, however, the notion of, quote, that's the only, but if the head emerges, then we let the two battle it out, because you can't take one life over another. In other words, life begins once the head emerges. Now, so that causes, you know, that, I don't know how that's worked out medically from a Jewish point of view. I'm not, you know, there's all kinds of permutations, but before the head emerges, the mother's life takes precedent if she is in hard travail. Hard travail has been interpreted to include psychological harm. It's changed a little bit in Orthodox circles, but there's precedent, clear precedent. For example, if the mother was exposed to rubella, had German measles, if the amniocentesis shows deformities, for example, in the thalidomide cases back in the 60s, abortion was permitted in the Orthodox world, by Orthodox rabbis. Hard travail included psychological harm. If a mother had 10 children, and the 11th, and she was just going to go over the edge and talk about her life, a rabbi could decide that abortion in that kind of case would be permitted. And clearly, the 10-year-old being raped and all rape cases, there'd be very little question about that. Now, the question is, what's the rationale? Now, putting on my law hat, because I used to be a lawyer, I guess technically I still am, but they tried to find out what's the rationale behind it. So there's two rationales that directly conflict. One is that the fetus, if by the fetus's existence and by what's going on inside, the fetus is analogized, according to Maimonides, as a rodef, one who is pursuing the mother to take the mother's life. I know that sounds weird. It's a legal fiction. In other words, in the natural course of things, that wouldn't happen. But in the unnatural course of things, however you define that, the analogy, the legal analogy is that the fetus is threatening or pursuing the life of the mother. And therefore you can terminate that in defense of the mother. That's Maimonides' position. Rashi's position is a little different. Rashi lived a generation before Maimonides. We're talking medieval, we're talking 11th century, 12th century, I'm just going to the basic. How did they look at it very long ago? And Rashi says that the reason why you can take the fetus, which is life, is because it's not a nefesh. It's not, but the nefesh has lots of different, can be interpreted as soul, but in this context, it's clear, I think to me it's clear, that what he's saying is it's not entitled to legal protection under Jewish law because it's not, doesn't have the status of a person. Nefesh has all kinds of layered meanings. It can be a soul, it can be a person, so it has those kind of, translations. But in this context, I think you can safe to read Rashi to say that what they're referring to there is that it's not entitled to the kind of legal protection that a human being is. And therefore, under this rubric of a threat to the mother's life, you can abort, and it's not murder. It's a very different paradigm, a very different legal paradigm than what you see, of course, in Christian theology. Yeah.
How could they perform abortions back in the 12th century? That's what I'm wondering. Is that possible?
It's
Things
not
like tinctures and
complicated.
herbs and.
Did you want to add?
Well, it's just, abortions are not very complicated. They're
Um,
complicated to perform. Complications from abortions are high, but you can do it. I mean, it's very
I
easy.
mean, don't they usually do a DNC? Isn't that how they do it? Usually.
Well, basically, yeah, I mean, that's
Could they
basically.
do that back in the 12th century? I mean.
Not the way they do it
Yeah.
now, sure.
Anatomy is anatomy, and they knew anatomy.
Right.
There must have been a lot more, there must have been a
When
lot
was the
more.
first Syrian?
Deaths, of course.
Yeah, they just think of the possibility of
Caesar?
infections.
That's what Caesar, I'm
No,
not
that's what
positive.
I've always been told.
You may be right, I don't know.
Well, because of electronics, we forbid, but maybe after Shabbat we'll look up.
Yeah,
We will,
I don't need to know.
okay. But I will say, the one area of conflict between the Jewish position and the Christian position is that is that life is sacred, and it's a mitzvah to have children. It's not that abortion on demand is not a Jewish position. It's just not. Whether it's Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox, abortion on demand is not. That's not to say because we live in a free society that we can't. People. That's the question for our society. But abortion on demand is not something that is favored in Reform, Conservative. A woman has, in Reform Judaism, it's the woman's choice. But it should be after reflection, after discussion, maybe even consultation, maybe with an ethicist, with a rabbi. But the ultimate decision, of course, rests with the woman. And that's where Judaism, or Reform Judaism at least, supports abortion as a matter of right. Is that helpful? We covered a lot. I have 20 after 11. Maybe we should conclude. Any other questions?
Just one other thing, isn't part of it too to save the mother can have children, assuming this one you take, the mother is there to be fruitful and multiply.
Right, exactly, yeah. If it's harming the mother, it may affect her ability later in life to have other children. Absolutely, yeah. And it's been my experience in having some counseling that it's not an easy decision. It's a very complicated decision-making process.
It's a very personal decision
For women.
too. I mean,
It's
that's the
very
part
personal.
that's.
There's guilt involved. There's real feelings involved about whether to terminate. It's not the women who I've counseled. It's not something. Of course, they're coming to me, so they're looking for religious guidance as well. But they're of course, I have a very open and very. I'm not one to put my to force my own personal views and be harsh or anything like that. I try to look at it from a person who's in front of me. What is it that's troubling them, and how can I be helpful in relieving the anxiety, the guilt, and all of that, so they can make the best decision possible for themselves. Where's the guilt coming from? What are the facts and circumstances? Talk to me more. How can I best understand? And the women who have come to me and have talked about whether to have an abortion is, they take it, it's not a clear cut. Of course, it wouldn't come to me if it was, right? But they take it, it's a serious decision. It's not something that's done lightly, and something that everybody should show a lot of respect for. The women who do have them, they have certain, a lot of things go into that. Far be it for me to say what those things are. We need to be, as a society, I think I'm on my soapbox, we need to be very sensitive about that and get away from some of the rhetoric in Bible, the Bible and whatever, as a weapon. The Bible's never intended to be a weapon. All right, I've said enough. So you ask one question, and here we are. We've covered murder, we've
From the
covered
stretched
testimony,
letter, we
we've
went to
covered
abortion.
courts of law, we've covered abortion. I think we've done it all. Just really being fruitful and multiplying. That much I won't go into. I'll leave that to your. I'll leave that all to you here. Why don't we continue now with the Misha Berach prayer on page 371. Then we'll do the Aleinu, and then we'll conclude with Ein Keloheinu. The Misha Berach prayer is on page 371. Molly?
Please join with me. Wow.
We pray for the healing of Rhoda Bennett, Harold H. Fink, Lori Weisberg, Judy Stein, David Cherniak, Harry Appleman, Phyllis Feibelman, Dr. John Johnson, Mark and Hetty Blinderman, Elise Zeman, Jennifer and Amy Sundberg, Pam Fisher, Mike Thornton, Bettina Prager, Lou Lartigue, Mark Schoenfeld, Alice Glass, Stephen Noga, Margene Rubin, Shana Silverman, Patricia Silverman, Jody Lovely, Elizabeth Kaiser, and Carolyn Perry. Is there anyone whose name is not on the list who they wish to add? Please.
Elise.
Thank you. Please rise for the Aleinu, page 586 and page 591.
Mishpach
may be seated. Today we observe the yard sites of J.B. Friedlander, Charles Hoffman, Sigmund Kahn, Marion Birkin, Evelyn Hoffman, and Paula Rader Olichny. Is there anyone who's reciting Kaddish for someone who they wish to remember?
Gilad Lori.
Thank you. Please rise for the mourner's Kaddish, page 598. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah b'yalma divrach yidutei v'yamlich malachutei v'chayechon v'yomechon uv'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael ba'agala uv'zman kariv imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam u'le'olmei almayah. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitroman v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitala v'yitala shemei d'kudsha b'richu le'elamin kol birchata b'shirata tushbachata b'nechamata da'amiran b'yalma v'imru amen. Yehei Shlomo Rabba Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom B'Roma Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen. May God, who created this harmony on high, bring peace to us, to all of Israel and to all of humankind, and let us say, Amen. You may be seated. Again, we want to thank Nate and Iris and David for having such a nice breakfast this morning. I certainly enjoyed it. And I hope that we'll continue to do either breakfast beforehand or a little lunch afterwards. It's just a very lovely way to start the Shabbat, talking to each other, just catching up on things, and encourage everyone to participate in that. Again, we always want to thank Molly and thank Andy for all that they bring to make the services so beautiful and accessible to so many. Did anybody ever sign on?
People tend to watch after.
Yeah, then we had a number of people last night. We had nice. Yeah, okay. Should we conclude our service?
Of course.
Okay. Let's conclude our service. I put down Ein Kalohenu on the service order, but
I
Molly.
think that works. I think as long as everyone sings along. Well,
I tried to pick something that I thought maybe.
Page is
It's page 626.
626.
Oh Shabbat shalom to everyone. Shabbat shalom.